Hello and welcome to the course Introduction to Advanced Cognitive Processes. I am Ark Verma from IIT Kanpur, and we are on the last lecture of the 7th week of this course. In this week, we have been talking about various aspects of cognition and emotion. By now, we have talked about the effects of emotion on attention, effects of emotion on memory. We also talked about the effects of various kinds of emotion, anger, sadness, positive emotion, anxiety, on different kinds of decision making processes, on on the kinds of judgments people would make, on their attitude towards risk taking, and etc. In today's lecture, I'll talk to you about a very interesting aspect of emotional decision making. We'll talk about personal moral dilemmas. We'll talk about how judgment and decision making can actually be affected in course of such moral dilemmas. I'll talk to you about what moral dilemmas are in a bit. So let's take the cognitive neuroscience approach to this problem. Now, cognitive neuroscience provides an alternative way of understanding the role played by the emotional factors in judgment and decision making. What kind of areas of the brain are actually involved when you're making such kind of a decision, being affected by such kind of an emotion. So when you're kind of looking at the brain and how the brain is actually helping you or influencing your thing. Much of the research within the cognitive neurosciences approach has focused on very difficult moral problems of a particular kind. These problems are, I'll refer to as personal moral dilemmas. Let me give you a couple of examples. So there is a trolley problem. Suppose you are riding a particular trolley, you are the driver of that trolley, and you reach a particular point that you have to divert the trolley to an alternative path. And if you don't divert the trolley to an alternative path, all 5-6 of the people riding the trolley will die. But if you divert the trolley on the alternative path, the trolley will run over one of the person who is working on that alternative path, and he will die. So the idea is, if you divert the trolley, one person will die. If you don't divert the trolley, all 5 people will die. This is one problem. The other problem is called the footbridge problem. The footbridge problem is the fact that there is again also a runaway trolley. This time you have to decide whether to push a fat person over a bridge. So there is a fat person in your trolley, maybe 5-6 of you are riding the trolley. One of these fat persons has to be thrown out of the trolley in order to save the life of 5 people. Now, the death will cause the person of this the pushing will certainly cause the death of the person that you will push away, but it will stop the runaway trolley and it will prevent 5 deaths. So how would you solve this problem? You can probably take a moment, pause the lecture, and then decide what you want to do. But I'll tell you what a lot of people do. About 90% of the people decide that it is worth diverting the trolley in the trolley problem, and only about 10% of the people actually decide that it is worth diverting a trolley in the footbridge problem. Both cases, one person would have died, 5 lives would have been saved, but the fact is that only 10% decide to actually divert the trolley in the footbridge problem, while 90% of the people decided that it is okay to divert the trolley in the runaway trolley problem. Why is this happening? According to Green, the difference between the two problems is that the footbridge problem triggers a strong emotional response. And the strong emotional response is to disapprove the pushing of a person and causing the death, even though that would save lives. More specifically, what we're doing is we are responding very strongly at an emotional level to the notion of causing direct harm to an individual. That is something which people wouldn't want to do. If something kind of happens, I kind of always think that there is a general apathy among people, but the fact is, how many of them are actually going to directly cause harm to the other person? That's a very interesting question to talk about. Now, problems such as the foot overbridge problem are known as personal moral dilemmas, and a lot of cognitive neuroscience research actually looks at the brain of people when they're actually making these kind of decisions. What is going on in their head when they have to decide on these kind of things? Green and colleagues they've conducted a lot of research dealing with these personal moral dilemmas. Another interesting moral dilemma is, suppose you are living in a village and your village has been attacked by enemy soldiers. Now these enemy soldiers have orders to kill all the civilians. You and some of your own townspeople have sought a refuge in a cellar of a large house. Outside, you're hearing the voices of the soldiers who are approaching. Now the fact is, you suddenly your baby, your child, starts crying. Your baby is begin to cry. Now the fact is, if you cover his mouth to block his crying, the baby will be smothered to death. So the idea is, if you kind of put your hand on the mouth of the baby will certainly die. But the fact is, if you don't stop the baby from crying, if you don't cover his mouth, if you don't smother him to death, the fact is the soldiers will get to know of all the 5-6 people, maybe 20 people, 100 people who are hiding with you, and they will die. So there are two approaches to this. Either you decide to save yourself and others, and you must smother your baby to death, or you decide to save the baby, but that obviously has a risk of getting anyone killed anyways, getting everyone killed anyways. So these kind of problems very hard. The crying baby problem, for that matter, is agonizingly difficult problem because of the conflict it is creating. On the one hand, there is a very powerful emotional imperative that you don't want to kill your own child, and that's the emotional argument. On the other hand, there's a very powerful argument that more lives can be saved if you just smother your baby to death. So would you want to kill your own baby to save everybody else's life, or would you want to save your own baby at the risk of everybody else's life? So there's a cognitive argument. There's an emotional argument that you must kill your baby because everybody you should not kill your baby, and the cognitive argument, you should kill your baby because everybody else's life will be saved. So this is a kind of a very complicated thing, and this problem is very hard because the emotional and cognitive factors are directly in conflict with each other. I mean, in common parlance, we say whether the heart is making the decision or the mind is making the decision. So this is such kind of a problem. Now, this explanation of decision making with personal moral dilemmas is basically known as the dual process theory. So, if the argument that I was saying, the emotional argument contrasted with the cognitive argument, it is basically referred to as the dual process theory of decision making. Some people, you would find that they would attach more weight to the cognitive argument than to the emotional one. They would generally make utilitarian judgments. Utilitarian judgment is obviously you want to save more lives at the expense of one life or two lives. Other people attach more weight to the emotional argument, and they tend to make what are referred to as non-utilitarian judgment. Just because you are emotionally attached to your child, you would not want to kill your child, and so but you are risking the lives of everybody else. Now, how can cognitive neuroscience pitch in? How can cognitive neuroscience clarify what is happening in such kind of decision making? Now, there are two relevant areas of the brain, two relevant regions of the brain that can kind of help us contrast these two decision making processes. One of them is the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in the frontal lobe of the brain, which is involved in cognitive control. So if you're doing cognitive evaluations, you'll probably expect this region to get lightened up. The other region is the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, is the region of the brain that is important for processing and the generation of emotion. So if somebody is going by the emotional argument, you would expect this region of the brain to lighten up. So let us look at how these two areas of the brain get activated when people are evaluating the cognitive or the emotional argument, and they should tell us a little bit about what the contribution of these two areas with respect to decision making are. Now, if you would want to look at the activity of the DLPFC and you wanted to compare the activity of DLPFC in people who made utilitarian judgments versus people who made non-utilitarian judgments, you would probably expect that formal individuals, those who are making the utilitarian judgments, you will probably expect that their DLPFC would show more activity. They are basically looking at the problem from the cognitive perspective. They are looking at the problem from response inhibition, response selection, evaluation of responses kind of perspective, which is basically the task that the DLPFC does. So people making more utilitarian judgment should show more activation in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Precisely this is what was reported by Green and colleagues in a study they published in 2004. So obviously DLPFC is linked with cognitive argument, evaluation of the cognitive argument, and making utilitarian judgments. Now let us move on to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Now if you're talking about patients who have a damage to the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, that is the Vmpfc, you would assume that because they cannot generate, because they cannot process emotions, these people would lack the emotional responsiveness. And because these people lack the emotional responsiveness, they would they will attach less weight to the emotional argument. They will also make more utilitarian judgments and less non-utilitarian judgments. Accordingly, we would expect such patients to be more likely than healthy controls to make, as I was saying, utilitarian judgment, putting more weight to the cognitive argument. Now, Keenings and colleague, they did this experiment in 2007, and they actually found that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex damaged patients made twice as more utilitarian judgments as compared to the healthy controls, which is 45% and 20% in the healthy controls. That is a massive number. That is something that is showing that the lack of emotional responsiveness because of brain damage is not allowing them to really attend to the emotional side of the argument at all. Now, this is interesting, and this is not really happening because the brain is damaged and they're not being able to think properly, because these people were administered so many different tests as well, and they performed fairly well across all the tests. So it is just about the emotional decisions that they are not really being able to make. Now, there's one limitation in Koenig's Koenig's and colleagues' study of 2007, that this is still, the evidence they are providing is not really a direct evidence of the fact that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex damaged patients are lacking emotional responsiveness. So what is happening here? You have to get to more direct evidence. So Morito and colleagues in 2007 and in 2010, they reported that ventromedial prefrontal cortex damaged patients, they approved more personal violations of moral dilemmas than controls. So if the emotional code is broken, these people are kind of fine with that. It is of importance to note that they did not really produce an emotional response even before or while endorsing the emotional violations of the person's morality. So again, this is supporting evidence for the fact that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex might be linked with the absence of emotional responsiveness and with making more emotionally neutral decisions. Now, these findings kind of link the Vmpfc and kind of establishes that the Vmpfc is involved in assessing the emotional consequences of personal moral violations. Further, the relevance of Vmpfc to emotional processing can be seen in individuals who have antisocial personality disorder. If you kind of look at the brains of psychopaths, murderers, killers, those kind of people, and if you look at their brain, and if you want to look at the ventromedial prefrontal cortex activations, what is happening there? These individuals also have a complete absence of empathy during when their intact cognitive processing is there. So they just lack any kind of empathy and any kind of emotional care for the other persons. So Hadinsky and colleagues, they wanted to study the brain activity in these criminal psychopaths in a study they did in 2010, and other imprisoned individuals in response to pictures showing moral violations. So they showed them scenes of crime, gruesome scenes and stuff, and they wanted to look at what kind of moral responses these people would give. The non-psychopathic prisoners did show greater activity in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and while they were viewing these pictures as compared to the other pictures. In contrast, there was comparable ventromedial prefrontal cortex in the psychopaths for all types of pictures, indicating that the pictures showing moral violations had no special emotional significance of them. So their thing is that they're treating everything equal. The emotional pictures are not really having any important status in their cognitive processing. So again, this is also in some sense an indirect proof that the ventromedial prefrontal cortex might be involved in evaluating the emotional arguments, in emotionally responding to such kind of a conflict scenario. So the DLPFC and the Vmpfc, and now you can see that if somebody is going by the cognitive argument, the DLPFC activation should be there. If somebody is going by the emotional arguments, emotional side of arguments, then the Vmpfc activations must be there. Now, there are sorts of limitations to these kind of studies as well. See, for example, in spite of this success of the dual process theory, it is a little bit oversimplified. It kind of just says that there are two boxes in which processing can happen. It's almost like a binary. And obviously, I mean, binary is not a great way to classify complex processes as decision making, complex ways of processing as emotions and cognition and those kind of things. And it's partly because the brain areas involved in decision making and moral dilemmas are much more widespread than just the DLPFC or the VMPFC. Cognitive processing is associated with several brain areas in addition to these two areas, and just pinning the grail of making such kind of decisions to these two areas, just localizing them is probably not a very useful strategy. On the second point, the account of cognitive processing with personal moral dilemmas is limited. It does not really cover all the aspects of decision making. It is assumed that the involvement of cognitive processing increases the tendency to prefer utilitarian judgments or decisions. So if people are doing more cognitive processing, they are going to take more utilitarian judgments. Now, there are studies which kind of talk a little bit about that. Broders and colleagues in 2011, they argued that the moral rule is the most accessible to the cognitive system that influences moral decisions. So if there is a cognitive system that has to take these decisions, it will probably make use of the moral rule. And in that sense, when participants in their study, when participants were presented with the Footbridge problem, preceded by the information designed to lead them to focus on the moral rule, say for example, saving lives is the rule, do not kill is the rule. Participants for whom saving lives was flashed, they found this rule more accessible, and it was significantly in favor of pushing the person off the footbridge than those who received the rule of do not kill. So they will probably make use of the more accessible moral rule. Okay, so that's kind of one way this processing is really happening. Now, so focusing the cognitive processes on certain moral rules sometimes can increase or decrease the tendency to make utilitarian versus non-utilitarian judgments. So it's not really about that somebody is looking at the cognitive side of the things or the emotional side of the things. The person is just trying to access a particular rule. If you prime them with the main rule, and the main rule is, let us say, saving lives, then either of the decisions will be easy. Or if the main rule is do not kill, then one kind of decision slightly becomes more difficult. So this is something that you have to be slightly cautious, that the dual process theory of making decisions might be slightly more complex, might be slightly oversimplified, and in a sense the explanations offered might not be really as effective. So I think that's all from my side about judgment and decision making, and I hope you like this section on cognition and emotion, various aspects of it. We'll meet you in the next week, which is the last week of the course. Thank you.